I should introduce myself. Bruce Campbell is my name, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is really the counterpart in Canada of the Economic Policy Institute, Larry's organization. So we're the leading progressive think tank, and we also have close relations with the Canadian labour movement. So this is the session on brainstorming about coherent progressive policy responses to promote sustainable recovery and sustainable economies. So while we'll probably be going over some of the same ground that we've already covered, the way I interpret it is that we'll be also moving into medium and longer term policy solutions, more structural types of issues, structural change types of issues. I'm, my role here is to, as I see it, I don't have any particular expertise, so that I will start the conversation essentially, and then moderate the discussion. And I would like to start by just putting on the table a number of elements in terms of medium and longer term policy elements to progressive policy responses to the crisis. I mean, the first one is full employment, and we've talked a lot about it today, and it is the first responsibility of government to do everything in its power through fiscal and monetary policy and other means to boost demand in ways that have the maximum effect on creating jobs. But I also see that in terms of, say, fiscal policy, that these measures should also be focused on investments and other measures that become the building blocks of the transition to a more equitable economy and a greener economy. Talk about fiscal policy, a word about monetary policy. I don't know what the situation in Europe is, but our Bank Act in Canada and the Federal Reserve Act in Canada, by law, these central banks are obligated to give high priority to full employment. They've jettisoned that in reality for some time, but that statutory obligation is still there, and so it is incumbent upon monetary policy to also be directed to maximize job creation and move towards full employment. Also discussed today, and I'm sure it will be further discussed in this session, is the issue of taming finance. We deplore its out of control, outsized economic and political power and the inherent continuous and growing instability in the financial system. And let's put on the table what measures by way of taxes and regulations we can bring in to help tame finance. We've already raised the issue of financial transactions taxes, which our Conservative government is deathly opposed to and has scuttled efforts in the forums that's been able to have some influence. But also things like excess profits taxes, taxes on CEO bonuses, regulation of the shadow banking sector, separation of commercial and investment banking, capital controls, and also, I think, and it's been discussed, a much greater role for public investment vehicles than has been the case in many countries. That's the second one. The third one, and it really follows from these, and I haven't heard it raised a lot, and so I'm going to raise it as a question and hopefully get some responses, and that is reducing inequality of income and wealth. Now, it may not be the case that this is occurred, this growth and inequality of income and wealth in Europe, certainly not to the same extent that it has in North America, in Canada, and the U.S. In the U.S., it's been extreme. In Canada, it's been a little less extreme, but still extreme. And Larry mentioned this morning the growing gap between productivity and incomes. Incomes for the majority, household incomes or wages, have basically stagnated for the last 30 years. And meanwhile, at the top, incomes have grown spectacularly. In the U.S., I think the top 1% has about 24% of national income now, and that's a threefold increase from 1980. It was about 9%, I believe. In Canada, it's doubled. It's gone from 7% to 14%. So there's been a huge increase in inequality, and and at the same time as these incomes have exploded, the taxes in Canada and in the U.S. On the very rich have decreased. So we have this bizarre situation in Canada where if you look at all taxes, not just income taxes, but all taxes paid at all levels of government, the top 1% is paying less as a proportion of their income than the bottom 10%. So you've got all kinds of real bizarre distortions in the tax system at the same time as incomes have exploded. And the same, I could tell the same story in the concentration of wealth, both in the U.S. and Canada. And I don't know the extent that it exists in Europe or has happened in Europe. I don't know. We heard earlier this morning, about how average incomes in Ireland has grown dramatically, at least until the crisis. And we know that crisis, from past experience, we know that in times of crisis, inequality rises and poverty rises. But what's been happening over the last 3 decades, certainly in Canada and the United States, is that through all of this, inequality has been growing dramatically. So, and it's not just kind of the moral untenability of this, but its impact on aggregate demand, the structural deficiency or insufficiency of aggregate demand has precipitated this huge rise in household debt. And household debt in both Canada and the U.S. is in record levels. Labor income as a share of national income has never been lower. So unless we address that issue, I don't think we're going to have a sustainable recovery. And so there's lots of things. I haven't heard it. I've heard a lot said about the corporate tax. But what about high income earner taxes, inheritance taxes? 50 years ago, the highest marginal income tax in Canada was well over 80%. And there were 15 tax brackets. And now there are only 3 tax brackets, and the highest marginal income tax rate is about 45-46%. So it's dropped dramatically, and the effective average tax is much lower. So there are strategies, measures that can be, I think, looked at and as appropriate, depending on the political context in the country we're talking about. That they may or may not be applicable, but so high-end income taxes, inheritance taxes, minimum taxes, as well as maximum taxes. No tax deductibility for corporations whose CEOs make a certain multiple of average incomes. There's lots of things that can be thought of. And on the spending side, social programs, public spending is actually now more, certainly in Canada, is now a more powerful vehicle of redistribution than through the tax system, because overall, the tax system is not highly redistributive. So there's much ability through strengthening social programs, public services, to also reduce inequality. And accompanying that, and there are many ways in which this can be done, is to increase the power of unions in relation to corporations. Regulatory measures regarding capital mobility, facilitating union organizing, wage setting. These are some of these things that exist in Europe and don't exist in North America. The fourth element that I would put on the table is leading the transition to a green economy. And here again, government leadership is required, and it must lead with strategies that not only advance the transition to an environmentally sustainable economy, but they create a new generation of well-paying green jobs. So in the process, and this cannot be kind of downplayed, is the importance of guarding against adverse equity impacts on low-income households. If you're going to make that transition, that has to be front and center. So there are a whole, array of areas in which that can be realized. I think someone mentioned buildings, constructions, retrofits, new construction, green manufacturing, increased local manufacturing capacity, closed-loop production, research and development. There's a long list. But I would add also, it certainly applies in many countries, is adaptation planning. So if countries are with climates warming, that has all kinds of implications, whether it's dikes in low-lying areas or upgrading water systems or storm sewers or even more localized sustainable food production systems. I would also, and this follows from something I just said, stress the importance of a green social contract. So strategies for helping workers transition to green jobs and to protect against widespread unemployment, and just transition packages which should include education, training, income support, mobility allowances, and so forth. And one of my colleagues has also suggested the notion of a carbon transfer. Obviously, carbon pricing is part of the mix. Let me not forget that. And higher energy prices. Someone mentioned yesterday that the average price of petrol in Ireland is about $1.70 per litre. Well, I don't know what it is in the US, but it's still under $1 per litre in Canada. So we're big polluters, big users of energy, carbon emission. Our ecological footprint is huge, and of course we have a government that has its political base in the core of the petroleum producing area of the country. And if any of you were at Copenhagen, you'll know that Canada was named a rogue petrostate for its spectacular missing of its legal commitments under Kyoto. So we'll try to deal with that in the next election. So I'm coming to an end. I had 5 down. I'm just going to shoehorn one last into that. So this may not be on your list, but it is on my list, and it may be on Larry's list as well, and that's trade and investment agreements, because they have become like economic constitutions, entrenching restrictions, entrenching power relationships. And I mean, these are, we're talking long-term, and we're, talking about measures that, will not occur easily, but we may be surprised. Who would have thought that the Berlin Wall would have come down in our lifetime? So altering these structural reform of these agreements, and we're in our case we're talking about NAFTA, but they could apply equally to the World Trade Organization. But altering the balance of power between workers and corporations, between public sector and private sector, and between intellectual property and private property, intellectual property between private property rights and the rights of society. If we could rebalance those. So, we're talking about taking strategic public sectors right out of trade agreements. Let's explore balanced trade and managed trade agreements. Again, let's get rid of mechanisms in trade agreements that allow corporations to directly sue governments for profits, anticipated loss of profits. Now, you probably don't know this, but Canada is currently in about the midpoint of a comprehensive trade and investment agreement with the EU. How many people knew that? Not many. There's not many in Canada that actually know it, but it might be considered to be a dry run for a similar negotiation with the U.S. It is quite possible that it could be playing that role. And one of the most insidious and pernicious elements of these kinds of agreements are these what are called investor-state vehicles, which permit this kind of intimidation of governments by corporations to not bring in the policies which hinder their expected profits. And this has been used to impose a great chill effect on environmental policy, particularly. And in cases where the cases have actually been brought, governments have been sued, and in some cases, Canadian governments have been forced to, or they have decided to settle and compensate companies for just those claims. And the final thing, and it's just briefly, and it's come up in the conversation today, and it's come up in the last 2 days in my growing understanding of the Irish reality, and that is measures to reverse the erosion of democracy. It really is brought home how the lack of central bank powers is a restriction on policy flexibility and ultimately on democracy, as well as the numbers in the Stability Pact, the 3%, and how that narrows policy flexibility. So how to broaden the policy space for democratic choice, how to democratize policymaking. In the case of Ireland, it has come up today, the incredible secrecy and lack of data, and lack of transparency in budget making. So those would be, that's my list, and I think it's, at this point, open the floor for your comments, and to just let the discussion flow. And I understand that Rory is going to be summing up the results of this discussion. So the floor is open.
My name is Paula Clancy from TASC, and I just wanted to ask you, I suppose, a little bit about a public kind of discussion or discourse or debate about this rising inequality that you have in Canada. Because I suppose Ireland, we've always had relatively high inequality, but it actually widened during the boom years, rather than just the crisis years. I suppose there was maybe a culture of contentment then, and now I think it's regarded as a luxury that can't be addressed, I think, as was said on one television programme just last week. So it's really difficult, it's a big challenge to try and even get it to be part of the public discourse, a serious, outside a small number of people. So I'm just wondering where that kind of debate is in Canada. Is it part of your public discourse?
Well, it's certainly part of our efforts to raise these issues and to put them on the public agenda. I mean, we have as you know, we do an alternative budget, and that's one vehicle through which we not only raise the issue, but we also propose alternative measures to deal with it. And you know, so I mean, I can only tell you about. I can tell you about what we do, and I can also say that, especially in the time of crisis, and that people have been more aware of the exorbitant salaries of CEOs, and we've helped to kind of stoke that awareness. We do every year at the beginning of the year. We examine the top CEO salaries, and we compare them. You know, we compare them to the average wage, and it's it's grown. It's grown elsewhere. In the U.S. or in Canada, if you make that comparison, the average of the top CEOs compared to the average wage, it's grown from about 100 times to about 175 times, a multiple of the average wage. But that pales in comparison with what exists in what has occurred in the U.S. And the way we kind of bring it home to people is we translate what that means in terms of how long it takes the average CEO to make the yearly wage of the average worker. So just after coffee break on January 1st or January 2nd, the average CEO has made, at least last year, even during the crisis, what it took the average worker a year to make. And that's the kind of thing that it just fuels outrage across the political spectrum, because the conservative populists see this as outrageous as well. So that's just an example.
Yeah, John Barry, Queen's University, Belfast. I'd like to throw out a provocative idea that we need to start questioning economic growth. Because it seems to me that we're now at a crisis, and I'm speaking in part from a green or environmental perspective, and not particularly to do with climate change, but to do with peak oil. And that we're now on the downslide of those available carbon resources. And I think it's a mistake we make in presenting any stimulus, green, Keynesian or whatever, as purely a tax and spend. We need to start looking at the subsidies to corporate welfare and the subsidies to locking us into a carbon-based economy. But it seems to me, and this is a profound challenge, I think, particularly to the labour movement, founded as it is on the notion of sharing out the rewards of economic growth more equitably, that we've now reached the point where economic growth over the past 40 years has led to a more unequal society. It's not adding to human welfare or well-being. In fact, reported levels of well-being and welfare have plateaued out. We've had a social recession for 4 decades that's in part been masked by focus on economic growth. And the average, if we think that the average economic modelling is that we need to grow the economy by 3% a year, this is biophysically impossible. We cannot decouple our energy and resource use to such an extent that we can continue growing our economy at 3% per annum. And we need to start seriously considering looking at alternative modelling of macroeconomics. And there's examples from Canada, the work of Peter Victor, slower by design, not disaster. Or even Tim Jackson's work that may be familiar to some of you about the idea of prosperity without progress or without growth. But it is a profound challenge to think about what does a non-growing, in the orthodox sense of the economy, actually look like, because we have a very real prospect of jobless growth for nothing else. But I think that Mother Nature doesn't do bailouts, is the bottom line on this, and I think it's a profound challenge to us all to try and present a model that, as is mentioned to some people over coffee, what replaces buildings, banks and boutiques as the model? The idea that of property, of speculation in deregulated finance or debt-based consumerism. Do we really think we can go back to that model? And in fact, I think that's the profound challenge for us all. What replaces it? But finally, I just want to echo what you said. This transition is inevitable. We are now living at the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel age. But this transition has to be a just transition. It's inevitable. We are already living in a climate-changed, carbon-constrained world. What we have to do now is actually plan for a just and equitable transition. I'd like to hear maybe some response from the top table.
I'm sure there will be responses to that. Yes. Oh.
Okay. Hello, my name is Rory O'Farrell from the European Trade Union Institute. And I'd like to say that I think you give the right answers have been given, but I'd ask a slightly different question for the Irish case. So the way I see it is during the boom years, we had lots of foreign money coming in, and this is basically how the boom was financed. And we need this foreign money was in the private sector and public sector, and we need to either repay that money or perhaps write off some of that. So, and the only way you can repay money to people abroad is through net exports. And one solution to that is we can have a very deflationary policy that will just kill off domestic demand in Ireland, and so also kill off our demand for imports, and we'll just be exporting to pay off the debt. But that's not such a pleasant scenario. Or else we can have a stimulus package that invests in productive things that boosts exports, but also we have to look at our imports. And I think how your answer is kind of applies to this question of the foreign aspect, is that we have to look at things like if we are sending lots of money out of the country to buy oil. So if we have a more environmentally friendly approach, it'll substitute for those imports. In Ireland, we've no car industry, so we'll say richer people, they spend lots of money on cars. But if we have a more equitable distribution of income, then we won't be sending money out of the country to buy cars, and instead we'll invest in public transport or bicycles. So I think this we can have the same answers to different questions, and I think it's important when we're thinking of a solution to the crisis in Ireland anyway, to remember this international constraint that we do have to either write off or pay back this money we borrowed over the past 10 years or so.
It's a great advantage in politics. Microphones fail from time to time, and whoever has the loudest voice gets continue to be heard. Bruce, my first question is a little bit cheeky. Canada is looked on by many European countries as a great example of a country that didn't get into desperate trouble. There are many Irish people now looking at Canada as a place to go. I wondered what capacity Canada has and for how long they can take some of our Irish emigrants. You might be able to tell me that, because I know many young people who are considering it as a place to go, sadly for us, but maybe good for you. But my second question is, rising really from Paula's question, how did you get the debate going about budgets and that? How involved are the people of Canada, the community of Canada, in what their governments are doing? I mean, that whole area of trying to engage the public through times when there isn't some crisis on is very difficult, and politicians here might run meetings, but you'll get your same old hardy members of your party turning up and maybe 3 other people who have an axe to grind. But I just wonder, has Canada any examples to show us how you, in between, Obama's trying these town hall meetings, is there any kind of system in Canada that might help us to understand how you have been as successful as you are, and are you bringing your people with you?
The other day, I've been here a few days, and one of the things that was suggested, and I took them up on it, was to take a bus tour of Ireland or of Dublin. That would have been a little. I wouldn't have been here if I'd done that. And I noticed. I think it was on one of the big streets by the river. I think it might have been O'Connell, but I'm not. I don't know for sure. But anyways, there was this big blue banner advertising work visas for Irish students in Canada, which I was just intrigued by that. And I guess when I was asked the question, when I mentioned it, and then I was asked the question about, is it true? Are they being, is this a con job? Or what's going on? I would say, listen, we have lots of space, and we welcome all immigrants, and we have a very multi-ethnic, multicultural society. 1 in 5 Canadians was not born in Canada, so we know how to accommodate diversity. It's one of the things that we do not badly. But we do have a youth unemployment rate of about 15% officially. So, I'm not sure how this is going to work, but this is not a discouragement to students and young people who want to come to Canada. It's just come with your eyes open. Don't just assume that the street's paved with gold. Listen, Canada has done a few things right, and I've mentioned the financial sector, but it's done a lot of things partially. It's done some things partially right and some things really badly, and I think it's quite possible that things are going to get worse. The Conservative government came into power, and this is, as I said this morning, this is a hard right Conservative government. It brought in a major fiscal stimulus in the wake of the crisis. It was dragged kicking and screaming at the threat of political death, but it did it. And it wasn't a well-structured stimulus, but it was substantial. And unlike the U.S., our provinces, we're very decentralized federation. Our provinces have a lot of autonomy, and they're not constricted by balanced budget legislation. So their efforts reinforce what was done at the federal level. So the impact has been positive. And as a result, you have our trade sector, our trade balances have led the OECD in terms of their deterioration. From 6 points of GDP decline from a trade surplus to now a trade deficit. So there's not an engine of exports, with a few exceptions, that's driving the Canadian economy. On the private investment side, there's been 6% increase since the trough about a year ago. On the consumer side, it's pretty flat. There was a bounce in kind of ironically real estate driven spending, but now household debt is at record levels, and that's not likely to go anywhere. And so the only real engine of recovery is the public sector, and this government is committed to winding that up at the end of this fiscal year, so in March. And so when I say a downturn or things could get much worse, that's one of the things I'm referring to. And finally on the engagement, I don't know if we have anything to teach anybody. If you look at participation, I think your record on voter participation is much better than ours, without knowing exactly what the number is, but we're under 60% now.
Generally,
Yeah. So there's a lot of apathy. There's there's cynicism, and this is the result of years and decades of governments or of conservatives kind of drumming it in that their government's the problem, government's not the solution, and therefore the solution is to have less government. And so now, in the wake of the crisis, with the bankruptcy of neoliberal ideas there for all to see, the proponents are still in power and still advancing those policies, and it tends to reinforce the apathy amongst the population. And Larry can talk about the Tea Party in the kind of the dynamism of the conservative response, and it's not to the same extent, but the conservative response to the crisis is very, very much alive, and it could go in a very scary direction.
Sort of corporate actions that have been put in place. Potash company is one of the very, very few large kind of potash, it's effectively fertilizer companies in the world, which is now being bid for, being taken over, and other suitors are waiting in the wings. There's a lively debate now going in Canada as to whether this is in Canada's interests. And the reason this is such a hot area is they provide fertilizer that helps to increase the yield on land in places like China, Ukraine, which goes to the whole point about the whole commodity cycle. And actually in the last, you mentioned that Mother Nature doesn't do bailouts, but Mother Nature does crisis. And we're not having a crisis yet, but if you look at the price of cotton, sugar, coffee, copper, pretty much the whole soft commodity complex, lots of industrial commodities, the prices really are rocketing. And we've already in the last year had a couple of mini, you've had a kind of a garlic, and I'm not joking, a garlic bubble or garlic crisis in China, where garlic prices shot up 5 times in a couple of weeks. In India, where onions are a staple good, you've had onion bubbles where the prices have doubled in a couple of months. So because of demand from the emerging markets, as well as supply squeezes, the commodity space is very, very hot. And I would say that in a year's time we will have, this will become a big socio-political issue. And in China they just had their 12th sort of 5-year plan. There are measures in that to begin to address some of this and to address the green economy. But I think, to your point on economic models, China is an economy that has to grow fast and at a high rate because it's so operationally geared. And if they try and slow down to a more sustainable level, you're going to go into an operationally leveraged recession, which would be catastrophic for China for 3, 4, maybe more years. And then to your second question, where does new growth come from? I think that is one of the key issues, not just in Ireland, but other countries like the UK, one of our neighbours as well. We shouldn't be focusing on getting multinationals to generate jobs, and we shouldn't be focusing on the old bubble sectors like construction. We should be focusing on reorientating some domestic industries to new markets like emerging countries like China, India, Indonesia. That's just a short comment from me.
Transitioning to a more sustainable economy and society.
Thank you, because this allows me to address 2 or 3 points that have been in my first draft report and that I had to give up in the negotiation, which of course I was very sad about it, but that tells you something about the current political debate on the EU scene. And also I would like to react on 2 or 3 things you said. First, I would be very interested to find out how the engagement of your bank is related to job creation. Because now in the EU, in the Lisbon Treaty that Ireland hopefully ratified, we have an Article 9 that says that any EU policies should look at its impact on jobs and social policies. But obviously we have not taken out all the salt of this disposal when we are figuring out our proposal. And in the report, I had tried to say that now when banks are going to do some loans, they should clearly look at what impact it will have on terms of job creation. And of course, at this stage I was defeated, so I will be very happy to find out what are your legislation in this field and maybe to try to bring it back home in the EU. The second thing is what you said on inequality and raising inequality on revenue and wealth is for me a cornerstone of the reason for this crisis. Let's not go back to a long story for outsourcing and over indebtedness of consumer in the US, but we all know the story, and the story is there. You had people getting less and less wages and thrown in the debt market to make sure they could sustain internal demand, and it's been years now. Beside global imbalances, we've been discussing the unfair share of added value. And of course, this was one of my big defeats in this report. It was not a 100% success because all this part of the report, of course, has been deleted and there's this one point where there's no common diagnostic in the European Parliament about it. And if I can recommend to you a book, I will give you the reference afterwards, but maybe you know about it, that was written by a Haiyan, former economist in the IMF. He has a full book that has just been issued on this topic that's called Fault Lines. And it's very interesting because it goes really deep in this origin of the crisis that, of course, oblige us to address the issue of taxation. And I think I mentioned it in my introduction that if we don't rebalance taxation between jobs and capital, we will not be really serious about taking the lessons out of this crisis. You also said about trade unions getting engaged in the whole discussion. I think this is a critical point. You know, as chairwoman of the Employment and Social Affairs Committee in the Parliament, I have to overlook each decision that is related to the engagement of the European Adjustment Globalization Fund. And one of the very important cases I had to overlook was the one of Dell in Limerick. And here I was really struck because there was 1,000 licenciements, I never know the word, I should know it, fires. And there were no trade unions to negotiate the implementation of the plan. And so this means the whole setting up of the plan was very bad, and the follow-up of the implementation of the plan was very bad. So I think you have a very strong point. When it comes to the transition to the carbon economy, and this goes back also to the issue of growth, I think here we need to be a bit more forward-looking as progressists. Because transition to lower carbon economy may require high long-term investment strategy, which is okay. But it's also mean that we will go for very high capitalist or now I have the word in French. Une activité très capitalistique, a very high capital requirement, an industry that requires a lot of capital, intensive capital industry, and not so much job creating. There will be a green jobs, but green jobs doesn't mean decent job, and so we always need to argue that when we're going to fight for green jobs, they need to be decent jobs, because if it's someone just taking the gardening in bad condition in towns, this is not going to be a decent job, and this is not what we want. But so we have to overlook this issue of high-intensive capital industry. I made it this time. But there's two other points we need to focus on. The first one is, if we're going to move to this low carbon economy, we need to agree for an increase of the energy prices, because this would be a strong market indicator. But then the one who will suffer first from this are the most vulnerable, because in their budget, the place for heating and transport is the highest. So we need to enter the discussion in what I had called in my report an energy shield. Because otherwise it will be, the inequality will even increase. This is not what we want. And the second aspect about it is of course decent job. Now on growth, this is my third big defeat in my report, because when I drafted the first proposal, I managed only to use once the word growth out of 220 paragraphs. Because I think growth is just an argument by the conservative for more profit. And I mean, we as progressive, we have no problem with growth if it means to move to a more sustainable economy and to create jobs. But we know that this is a trick that they are using, but they are not consistent in this strategy, because they are only using growth. I'm being blunt, but this is the reality we have to face. They only want growth for higher profits, and they don't go hand in hand with what should be the result of growth, that should be less inequality and better redistribution. So the argument that you need growth to have redistribution, we should not get in this trick they have. This is why also I think the whole battle around the indicators is an important one. It doesn't mean when you have an indicator you have the solution, because of course we all know you can cheat with indicators, but at least it gives you something for a fair discussion. And there's one question I would be very interested to put to you, is when you're saying we need to rebalance trading agreement. I cannot agree more, but where do we start, how do we do it, and what do we ask?
Put me on the spot. Yeah. Well,
I'll try. Does this mean the whole WTO arrangement is to throw away, or do we need to fight for in the UN?
Well, I would like to be. I remember years ago as a student, I was in a convocation event where Joan Robinson was being honored. It was at Carleton University in Ottawa. It was in the 70s, and it was the time of stagnation and questioning of Keynesianism, and so this guy in the audience kept harassing her about what she would do, and she, rather than kind of give elaborate answers, she just looked at him and said, "What power do you give me?" You know, and took that. I mean, that was kind of the essential question. So, given that we're not omniscient and we're not all powerful, where do you start? And I mean, I think the short answer in our case is to look at a current negotiation that's going on, and that for us is the Canada-EU agreement, which isn't to say that in principle the idea of having a relationship, an economic relationship with the European Union isn't a good thing in principle, and we welcome it because of our overdependence on the United States, but it's another thing to say that equates with the public good, because we're talking about in these agreements private interest. So that's where we start. I mean, I think, we can have this conversation in the context of NAFTA. There is a WT negotiation that's going on that hasn't been completed. So I think that, you start where, once you've got an agreement in place, it becomes slightly more difficult to reverse it. But there are ways to undermine, circumvent, and I just think it requires a lot of determination and persistence. It may not be a satisfactory answer, but I think that's we can discuss further some of the concrete measures.
Yeah, on this, in the European Parliament, now we are having a huge row on ACTA, which is about the internet
Yes.
world agreement with the US. It's a very, very hot topic.
Yes, and I mean there are areas where an agreement would work. I mean, to those of us who see something like this, an agreement like this, as promoting an upward harmonization of standards, of wages, which was the concept behind the European Community, European Union, from the beginning, or certainly as it played out. We embraced the REACH program. That would be a really positive thing. But as it is in NAFTA, and in NAFTA, offshoots were locked into agreements that put downward pressure on regulation of toxic chemicals. So it's not to talk about no agreements at any period, but that it's what kind of agreements and who's negotiating and who benefits and who's influencing the negotiation. So that's the issue that we're concerned about. Just quickly on the central bank. Our central bank was created at the height or the depth of the Depression in the 30s, 1935, and at that time, written in the law was the obligation of governments, of the bank, to ensure that its policies promoted high employment as well as reasonable price stability. And throughout the whole entire Keynesian period, it was articulated after the war as a full employment policy overall, and the bank supported that policy, and its measures reflected that. And so for that period of time, we had basically full employment. It wasn't until the ascendance of neoliberalism that, in effect, inflation control became the only mandate of the central bank. And they even tried to change it in our in a constitution that they tried to bring in the early 90s, unsuccessfully. But still, they've been honoring this part of the statutory obligation in the breach, and it's time to reverse that. Let's open the floor to discussion and continue the debate. And maybe someone wants to continue to look at the issue of transition to a steady state economy. Is that what you have in mind?
Just a few things. I think perhaps the talk of growth being a negative thing would be very hard to, even with the best of intentions, to deliver that message to the public. And I'm not certain that it's the right message anyway. Just to say that from observing kind of this conference, which is obviously an excellent jump up from the general commentary, there is a lack of direction, but there's a lack of confidence, primarily among the political class and among the public following from that. And I think that there are an awful lot of avenues where confidence can emanate with a kind of a refocusing or a recontextualization of the crisis. So the context I'd like to highlight that just comes from a personal amateur interest is the impact of technological evolution and exponential growth in technology on economy. And if we see economy as a reflection of society's ability to manipulate its environment and to make its life a little bit better. So in a very simple case, and I know for economists this is chronically simple, but if I compare myself to someone who's much higher up in this societal stratosphere in 1910, I think in every measure other than how people perceive us, I win in terms of what my access, my transport, my healthcare, my longevity, and so on. So that, in fact, economics is there to enable technological development. And I mean that in the widest sense of what technology means. So I think that people are familiar with Moore's Law, I presume, the doubling of the processing and transistor chips that was suggested by George Moore in 1965 might continue for another couple of years, and is still going. And that exponential growth is counterintuitive, it's discomforting, but it's absolutely astounding. And it shows avenues that are opening up in nanotech, in genetics and robotics, that would mean that the advances that are coming are much greater than the advances that have gone. As an example of this, there are potential nanotech carbon catchers, which may make the whole green conversation quite different. Just a couple of things. I think that Ireland should obviously push very hard for this, should probably create its own equivalent of an MIT, a genetic nanotech and robotic institute, should have entrepreneurs involved in that and surrounded, perhaps do this in a greenfield site. I think that you have an opportunity with data and information to mine it. So similar to if Ireland found a massive field of some sort of mineral under its ground, it could employ people to mine that information, or to mine that gold or whatever it is. And if you could have some sort of innovation centre where people are, just like leaving school, you're entitled to a public education or private education, I think you might be entitled to a public job. We're already supplying social welfare, and I think that there are arrangements that the government could make in tandem with companies and other agencies where the mining of information and the management and the use of that information could actually become a public sector activity, but it's not limited in terms of the amount of people you could employ in this, to be honest with you, and each person would give a return on investment. Just a couple, I know I'm going on now, but I've been thinking about this for 2 years.
Maybe we'll have a whole session on it.
No, sorry. I think there's online education, which also should be put forward now. Bill Gates is talking about in 5 years funding online education systems, and I think that even if they don't get the accreditation desired for degrees or even entrances to normal universities, this should be something that should be pushed by the government for people that are currently unemployed and could again use the PCs in schools and so on. Just the last couple of things. Sorry, my apologies now. I think that there could be a savings scheme in the public sector. I know this is a slightly separate issue, but as I say, I've been preparing a while. I think for the public sector, you could, about 20 years ago, I worked in the private sector in Luxembourg, and there was an incentive which said that if you could discover a cost-saving measure for the company, you got 10% of that saving. And I think if that went in the public sector in Ireland, just as simple as that, it would make a massive difference. Because the savings, I mean, it's comical, the savings that are available. It's the management down system that isn't allowing these to materialise. And if public sector workers were allowed 10% of the savings that they suggested, you would make a pretty impressive start into that. One last thing, and I promise I'll finish it. On the corporation tax, I have a funny feeling that as well as confidence, we need to look outwards and say, look, this is what we're going to do. And as opposed to run from one, as was said, one spectre to another spectre in fear. We need to explain that this is what we're going to do. And I think one of those things would be to increase corporation tax. I think that first of all, it wouldn't. A small increase would certainly not send companies running. But there is a sort of something we've inherited from the last 15 years of governance, where particularly something like Shannon, where it was clearly implied, if it wasn't explicit, that we were not going to stop rendition flights because American companies might leave. And I think that lack of principle and that I think pragmatism as a word should be outlawed for about 10 years. That version of pragmatism was hugely damaging because it goes to inequality and it goes to all these other things. Last thing in the technology investment.
Oh, that wasn't the last thing.
Sorry. My apologies. Okay.
I'd like to say something about the generational aspects of the crisis, in that people have talked about the fiscal crisis, the banking crisis, the employment crisis, and a large element of the employment crisis is actually generational. So we have maybe up to 90,000 unemployed graduates. There's a likelihood that over the next 5 years, 150,000 Irish graduates will emigrate. We have 150,000 unemployed construction workers, many of whom are under 30. So the policy responses have to reflect those particular characteristics of the crisis. So that's on one side. On the other side, in terms of how we could fund any of the initiatives that might address that, I think it's definitely time to look at the National Pension Reserve Fund. 40% of the 24 billion that was in that fund is now in the banks, and it's not clear what return there will be on that 10 billion that's gone into the banks. So there's 14 billion that remains, and the National Pension Reserve Fund was set up to fund or help to fund public sector pensions after 2025. Now, if we have a further 5, 6, 7 years of austerity and a likely 10 years of stagnation in the economy, it undermines the position of the role of the National Pension Reserve Fund. Anyway, the economy is going to be so small in 2025. So now is the time to take a good portion of that 14 billion and invest it in the generation who are largely the victims of the crash.
Thank you.
The New America Foundation. I'd like to pivot off the comment raised by the colleague from Belfast about really inviting thinking about the future. And then I do sort of agree with the colleague at the back there. I don't think that the right way to approach this is by sort of thinking of in terms of an anti-growth line. You mentioned Joan Robinson, and Joan had another great line, which was that in a capitalist system, it's better to be exploited than not to be exploited.
Yes, I remember that.
So this is the problem that you have to deal with. Now, I would suggest instead, and there is something very big here that might motivate all of our work in a very constructive way, is that we should instead frame this thought about the future, what is this issue of tackling the future, in terms of a debate over the good society. What is the good society? And this is actually a project that Andrea Nahles, the General Secretary of the German Social Democratic Party, is now trying to initiate. And I think it could be extraordinarily invigorating and really is some way of connecting and motivating our work. It can contribute to a tremendous revitalization of ideals, a reinvigorating of progressive politics. It is the sort of, in a concrete sense, if you tackle this good society issue well, it sort of is the way is the doorway for a new politics and a doorway to a new set of policies that I think we like. I mean, this morning we were struggling with this problem of the austerity agenda and the choice between extreme austerity or austerity. The good society, once you begin to engage in that way, that clearly is not the way to meet the needs of a good society. So I would urge us in our work to think big, that this really is the opportunity of the crisis, to put some big capstone issue that then our economic modeling and thinking and policies support and have a political logic behind them that I think can be very attractive.
Anthony from TASC. Just interested in getting a view from the panel on how we reconcile the fallout of the fiscal and banking crisis with the need to transition to a low-growth, carbon-free economy. And I suppose we've heard all during the day I suppose the fallout of the crisis here is the huge overhang of debt and the constraints that is put on the economy, and unemployment, lack of investment. And what we need to transition the economy is huge investment you're talking about, and protecting the impact of that transition on vulnerable groups. Recently we had business lobbies coming out here in Ireland saying we can't afford to go green just yet because we're in such a mess, in terms of the price of carbon. Like at the moment we do have a carbon tax, but
It's actually, it doesn't reflect the full opportunity cost of carbon. So there's lots of issues that are going to. It was difficult anyway because we saw also what happened in Copenhagen in progressing the climate change agenda. But now with the fallout of the crisis, it's just going to make that more difficult. So just interested in what the views of the panel might be in terms of how we actually practically go about that, given the current situation. Thanks.
Well, it's a trade unionist from Norway. So there have been some challenges to trade unions here. I completely agree that the presentation you made that we are facing a multiplicity of crises and also integrated into each other. But what I feel is lacking in this kind of discussion, also here today, but many other discussions I've been taking part in, is that the question of power is not being taken up in a way. Because I think even in Norway, you all know that Norway is one of the most lucky countries in the world with all this oil revenue and all that. We can solve all problems. But even in Norway, the inequality is increasing, poverty is increasing. All these characteristics of the neoliberal society has also come to Norway, but maybe not at the same degree as in many other countries. But it is happening. And the reason for that, of course, is also in Norway there's been an enormous shift in the balance of power in society, and that is the main challenge I think we have. What has happened over the last 30 years is an enormous change in the balance of power, and that is the thing that is influencing all these crises. So when we are talking about demands on growth-free economy and whatever we do, we have to relate it to the question of power. What kind of mobilization do you foresee in order to change this balance of power, to start another development? And that is enormous. So I think we do have to address the question of power at the same time as we discuss alternatives and demands and so on. Thank you.
And across Europe in recent times, most notably in the last days with the 5% vote secured by the Sweden Democrats, where there's been a rise of populist radical right across Europe. And I think one of the things we have to stress is that this is a product of a generation of neoliberal undermining of the security that social democracy built in Europe in the 20th Année Glorieuse after the Second World War, and that, as Sherry Berman argues, it was the way in which social democrats supplied security that meant that they defeated the fascists in the 20th century. We're not up against a Nazi threat at this stage, but we are facing across Europe a very serious populist radical right threat, and one of the ways we need to defeat it is by ensuring the recovery as such as to restore the security that working class and other popular class members have lost over recent decades.
Amen.